It is my great pleasure to introduce our fourth Global Challenges Conference. And this year, the topic is Development in Crisis, Changing the Rules in a Global World. I would like to now briefly introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Dani, who is the Rafik Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He is one of the top economists in the country, and I would argue probably in the world, who writes on development, international economics, and political economy. He has an undergraduate degree from Harvard and a PhD and an MPA from Princeton. He is very prolific in his writings, many books, many articles, and he is one of these wonderful scholars who puts some of the data sets he's working with on his website so that other people may use them as well. He's affiliated with the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Center for Policy Research in London, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a long-standing and outspoken critic of the Washington Consensus, with its unequivocal support for free market policies for developing countries, and he is a leading thinker on the impact of globalization on economic development. I will not list all his books and all the prizes and everything else. I would just like to highlight two of his books. In 1997, Dani Rodrik wrote a book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? ? Which in Business Week was named one of the top books of the decade. A good dozen years later is no longer a question mark, but is a period or an exclamation mark, because his latest book is The Globalization Paradox, which seems to suggest that globalization has gone indeed too far. We are very fortunate that he will give the keynote tonight, and please join me in welcoming Dani Rodrik to Manhoya.
Thank you for showing up. What I'm hoping to do in my presentation is to give you a perspective that draws on my research and others about the recent experience with economic growth in the developing world, in emerging markets, and what that suggests for the future of economic convergence. That is the closing of the gap in living standards between the poor majority in the world and the rich minority. One of the themes, or maybe the key theme of this conference, is development in crisis. But there's something a little bit incongruous in that, in the sense that for hundreds of millions of people around the developing world, many people in dire poverty, others who would certainly be considered very poor in the advanced countries, but in the context of their economies might be lower middle class or middle class. For hundreds of millions of people, the last few decades actually have not been all that bad. They've been better than any they or their parents or previous generations had. Not only in absolute terms, but also actually in comparison in terms of relative performance or changes in performance over time to what was happening in the advanced parts of the world. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and this is the first one. It's a picture that suggests a very interesting trends in economic growth since the end of the Second World War. What I have done here is basically just smooth out year-to-year fluctuations in the growth rates of different parts of the world economy, and just show you what the overall trend line is. And I've broken the world up into two groups, the developed world and the developing world. The developed world is basically North America, Europe, and Japan in Asia. And the developing world is essentially all the rest: Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and all of Asia except for Japan. Now, what you see here is that for much of the decades since the Second World War, this chart starts in 1950, the growth rate, what's on the vertical axis is the growth rate of these different groups of countries. The growth rate of the developed countries actually exceeded that of the developing countries. So what that means is that basically developed countries, advanced countries are actually growing faster, and therefore the gap in terms of the living standards of the poor versus the rich was getting wider. But something happened towards the middle part of the 1990s, and particularly since over the last 10, 15 years or so, that the growth rate in the developing world picked up, and picked up in a very significant way. And the growth rate in the advanced parts of the world continued to decline, so that when we have this striking divergence in economic performance between these two groups of countries, to the point that just before the Asian crisis, and in fact, just before the global financial crisis, and continuing through the crisis in an even more extreme way, the difference in the annual average per capita growth rates of the rich versus the poor countries in the world had opened up to 4 percentage points or more, a huge difference. The good news here, of course, is that this experience of the last 10, 15 years suggests that on average, that the developed world has been converging in terms of overall living standards with that of the advanced parts of the world. Not only that, they've actually been converging at a rather rapid rate as well. Now, the developing world, of course, as you know, is a very heterogeneous group. That includes Asia, it includes the high performers, China, and East and Southeast Asian countries, but also, of course, includes countries in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. One of the striking features of this experience of the last 15 years or so is that, in fact, the pickup in growth has been rather uniform. So in this picture, what I've done is break up the overall trends in the developing parts of the world into 3 different regions: Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So you can sort of see what these different regions were doing. The picture with respect to Asia, is the red one on top, is of course something that points to the very significant success in achieving rapid economic growth in East and Southeast Asia. First, of course, starting with Taiwan and South Korea in the early 1960s, then spreading on to Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. And then, since the late 1970s, of course, the Chinese growth boom that takes off. And that has essentially meant a steady and very rapid increase in Asian economic growth. You will notice that that's sort of trending up. It's partly because China is becoming a bigger and bigger part as it grows of the Asian aggregate, and therefore it's pulling up the average as a result of that. The other parts, Latin America and Africa, haven't been doing nearly as well, and you can see that, in fact, through the 1980s and some of the 1990s, that the gap had been opening up. But the good news, again, from the perspective of the last decade or so, is that even Latin America and Africa have been growing at a much higher rate than before. In fact, they have caught up and to some extent surpassed even a little bit the growth rates that they had experienced in the 1950s and early 1960s, which by historical standards were actually quite high. Of course, Asia is still growing very rapidly, much more rapidly than the rest, but the good news is that even Latin America and Africa are now growing more rapidly than they were in the 1980s and much of the 1990s. So this is a remarkable reversal in fortunes since the 1990s. And in some ways, this is exactly what should happen. This process of convergence that we have experienced in the last 10, 15 years is, in some sense, what ought to happen as a normal thing. Because after all, when you think about what poor parts of the world need, what developing country needs, the technologies that they need to increase their productivity, the markets that they need to sell their products, the financing that they need in order to finance their investments, in the world economy that is globalized is already out there. They don't need to reinvest, they don't need to reinvent the technologies that the rich countries have already invented. The markets are there. In principle, the financing and financial markets and credits are there. So we should think of convergence on the basis of first principles as something that ought to be the expected normal state of things rather than an exception. Historically, however, the kind of convergence that we have been experiencing recently is very much the exception rather than the rule. At some basic level, that's obvious, otherwise wouldn't still have the world divided into rich countries and the poor countries, so that there must have been some divergence. But what's striking is that regardless of the time horizon, that any time you take a relatively long period of time and you ask the question, has there been a tendency for poor countries to grow more rapidly than rich countries? In other words, has there been a tendency for the convergence gap to diminish? The answer almost always is no, that the pattern is not one of convergence. So what this shows is the relationship between initial per capita incomes in different countries and the subsequent growth rate experienced by different countries over 4 different time horizons, all the way from the earliest period from which we can carry out this kind of systematic comparison, the period between 1820 to 2008, from the upper left, to the period between 1950 and 2008, the entire post-Second World War period. And the slope of the line tells you that there is, in fact, hasn't been any tendency for poor countries to grow more rapidly. If there had been one, of course, then you would have had a downward sloping slope, which is that the poorer countries grow more rapidly, the richer countries grow less rapidly. And the absence of any such slope suggests that there hasn't been any tendency for convergence over such long periods of time, so that what we have been experiencing in the last decade or so is unusual. The question is, what do we make of it? And there are sort of 2 important questions. One is sort of how do we interpret this period of recent convergence? And the second question is, what does that tell us about the likelihood that it is going to continue, that we are going to be experiencing continued convergence? There are reasons to be both optimistic and pessimistic about the continuation of this trend of convergence. And I'll just sort of signal off the bat what those reasons are. On the positive side, the kinds of policies that many developing countries have been following, have been pursuing, are policies that are much more market-friendly. They're also much more conducive to the integration of their economies into the world economy. And as I'll indicate in a somewhat greater detail in a few minutes, these policies are, in a conventional standard sense, much better policies. Therefore, on that account, you might say that this has set the base for continued convergence. On the other hand, for the period since about 2000 has been a rather special period that has perhaps artificially spurred the growth of a lot of the emerging and developing parts of the world. This was a period of relatively high commodity prices, and since many developing countries are commodity exporters, that tends to boost their economic growth when commodity prices are high. A number of developing countries grew very rapidly by borrowing a lot of money from international financial markets, and this was a period of financial globalization. There was a lot of money available for them to borrow. And then when we project this into the future and we say, are these things likely to continue? Well, it's not quite clear that given the state of the advanced countries in the world, that either we will continue with very high commodity prices, or given what has happened with the global financial crisis, that we are going to be experiencing and continuing to experience on an ongoing basis such an era of cheap and available short-term or long-term finance either. Now, the basic point, however, is that in order to be able to answer these questions, we need to have a perspective, we need to have an understanding of what are the fundamental drivers of economic growth and how they are likely to change. So let me present to you two such perspectives, two interpretations from which you can use to analyze this growth performance and to make some kind of judgments about the likelihood of these trends to continue. What I will call the orthodox view is that convergence or sustained economic growth requires a set of good fundamentals. And what those good fundamentals refers to is a series of policies which, just for lack of any other shorthand term, we might call Washington consensus policies. What are those Washington consensus policies? They are policies of opening up to the world economy, deregulating markets, privatizing state-owned enterprises or parastatals, providing adequate protection of property rights and enforcing contracts, ensuring that the macroeconomic environment is conducive to low inflation and debt sustainability and so forth. So the standard tenets of orthodox policy, which sort of we associate with the Washington consensus. And the standard orthodox view is that if you do all these good things, then that produces high growth. And this would be sort of the one way in which to interpret that. Now, it turns out that this view has run into a lot of problems in recent decades. And one problem is, one can look at these problems in a number of different ways, but one way to simply illustrate that problem is to focus on the results achieved by some of the countries that have actually tried to take on this agenda. I'm just showing you here just two countries, two Latin American countries. I should say, as you probably know, Latin America was the region that adopted the Washington consensus agenda the most wholeheartedly of all developing parts of the world. Two important Latin American countries here, Brazil and Mexico. Mexico pretty much adopted the Washington consensus wholesale. On top had certain additional advantages such as the NAFTA and duty-free access to the North American market. Brazil did a fairly good job of adopting the Washington consensus, but probably isn't the most slavish adherent of it. Now, what's striking when you look at the experience of Brazil and Mexico, and these aren't exceptions in Latin America, this is a Latin America-wide phenomenon, is that their recent performance has paled in comparison to the performance that they had in the recent past. So here, if you compare Brazil and Mexico's growth after 2000, leaving aside the period of their debt crisis in the 1980s and the period of recovery in 1990, so in some sense, just throw those decades out, just compare the pre-1980 performance with the post-2000 performance. What's really striking is that what looks like a good performance, let's say for Brazil, Brazil is always mentioned as one of the sort of countries that has been doing really well in recent years. What's really striking is how poorly actually Brazil has been doing compared to its own experience before 1980, in the periods between 1950 and 1980. Now, this is striking. It's striking because the policies that Mexico and Brazil had in the 1950s and 60s and 70s were policies that were utterly horrible from the perspective of the Washington Consensus. They had very high rates of trade protection. They had industrial policies running rampant. Subsidies and state-owned enterprises were all over the place. And macroeconomic stability, well, there was more like macroeconomic instability rather than macro stability, in the sense that prices, inflation rates tend to be high, and so on. So the striking thing is despite the adoption of policies that from the standard conventional lens looks so much better, these countries have been doing worse, not only relative to the Asian countries, as I've showed you before, but actually relative compared to their own recent experience. Now, the orthodox approach has reacted to these results by essentially enlarging the set of policies which countries need to do. So rather than essentially admitting defeat and in some sense saying, well, maybe we haven't gotten the quite right fix in terms of what you need to do to sustain growth, the approach has been to say, well, maybe it wasn't enough to liberalize your trade and privatize your state enterprises and deregulate your economy and run stable macroeconomic policies. Maybe you needed deeper structural reforms. Maybe you needed to reform your labor markets at the same time. Maybe you needed to reform your governance. And of course, it ends up being an open-ended list, which allows proponents of this view to always say, if countries are failing, to say, well, maybe they did 25 things on the list, but I have 2 other things on the list that they should have done, but they didn't, and that's why they're failing. The second perspective, which I find much more helpful in trying to understand what is going on, goes back to an earlier tradition in development economics, a structuralist tradition that emphasizes that poor countries or developing countries aren't just shrunk versions of advanced countries, that the challenge of development, the challenge of increasing productivity, aggregate productivity, is a challenge of changing structure. Changing structure in what direction? Changing structure from traditional low productivity industries such as subsistence agriculture or low productivity services to modern industries, tradable manufacturing or modern service industries. And the key, what you need to get convergence going is to get that convergence machine humming. The kind of policies that getting that convergence machine to hum requires are the policies that are going to stimulate those new industries, that's going to stimulate entrepreneurship, investment, employment in those new, emergent, modern, tradable industries. And those are going to include a rather eclectic mix of policies, including often industrial policies or currencies, or undervalued currencies that act as to subsidize these modern industries. Now, I want to emphasize is that to some extent, the kind of policies that are required under the 2 perspectives may overlap. It is clear that if you are in an economy where the government essentially stands ready to pounce on any entrepreneur who's actually successful to extract through taxes or bribery or other methods the profits or the rewards of that investors' or entrepreneurs' efforts, then it is quite clear that neither will you get what the orthodox view predicts or wants, nor will you get the kind of structural transformation that you need to happen under the structuralist performance, because under the structuralist perspective, because nobody will have sufficient incentive, in fact, to invest in these new industries. So there is a certain amount of overlap between the policy implications of the two perspectives. Similarly, hyperinflation obviously is not very conducive to structural transformation either. So it is not the case that there is a huge contradiction between these two ways of looking at things, but they imply different agendas, they imply different priorities. Sometimes, for example, the policies that the orthodox perspective prescribes, such as deregulation or the privatization of the financial sector, or a very drastic opening up, may in fact undermine some structural transformation incentives by, for example, pushing some manufacturing industries into open competition on world markets before they have had a time necessarily to compete. At the same time, sometimes the policies that the structuralist perspective requires, such as industrial policies, direct policies of assistance to manufacturing industries, are going to directly conflict with the policy agenda of the Washington Consensus, because you're not supposed to be doing those kinds of interventionist policies. So there is overlap, but there are also tensions and different differing priorities. Now, let me give you a bit of a sense on sort of why the structuralist perspective is important. Structure is important because in developing countries you have huge heterogeneity in the productivity with which different activities are carried out. This is true of all countries, but it is especially true of developing countries. That even in some of the poorest African countries, you can find economic activities that are produced with productivity that is relatively close to the global benchmark. The problem is that too few of that economy's capital and labor is actually in those high productivity activities. Most of it is locked up in very low productivity activities. So here, for example, is for a set of 9 African countries. This is the relative productivity of 9 different sectors in African economies. You can see that basically roughly almost sort of 60% of the population is in agriculture, which operates at something like 50% of the productivity of the, of the average productivity of these economies. You look at sort of manufacturing sector, which is over here, you have a very rather limited number of workers there at somewhat sort of 17% higher average than for the economy as a whole. Now, to some extent, this cascade is a little bit misleading because, for example, you look at the mineral sector over here with an extremely high labor productivity, that's because it's very capital intensive. So there's no way that you can actually take these farmers over here and put them all into the mineral sector. There's no way you can do that. But it's certainly not the case that you couldn't take these workers in agriculture and put them in a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing. And since manufacturing here, labor productivity is double labor productivity in agriculture, without any even additional investment in this economy, you would be making these people's, these workers' earning power, you would be doubling them. And in fact, this is a lot of how development in practice takes place. It takes place by taking people from these low productivity activities and putting them into the higher productivity activities. So the fact that there are these huge structural heterogeneities, and by the way, this is a relatively aggregate classification, you can take each one of these sectors and break them up into subsectors too, because even agriculture is a mix of traditional agriculture, subsistence agriculture, and maybe some horticulture or some floriculture where labor productivity is actually quite higher. So you'll see a huge heterogeneity even within agriculture as well. So that means that even within agriculture, by simply reshuffling production, reshuffling workers, you can get huge boost in overall productivity and earnings without necessarily increasing a lot of investment or accumulating capital in that economy. Now, this is a key characteristics. The structural gaps in productivity is a key feature of developing countries because we know that these structural gaps tend to diminish over time. I said earlier that even in advanced countries, in rich countries, you have these heterogeneity in productivity. But what's striking is that these things tend to diminish. So if you look at what is happening, so what is this on the vertical axis is a measure of this heterogeneity in labor productivity across different sectors. And on the horizontal axis is the average productivity or average income across countries. And there's a very clear negative slope in this relationship that you get a convergence within the economy of these productivity differences. So a lot of the convergence actually that happens between rich countries and poor countries, if the development process works as it should, is that not only that the average between the developed country and the developing country gets closed, that gap closes, but also the averages or the heterogeneity within the developing countries also tend to get closed down, so that heterogeneity becomes less and less. Okay? Part of the reason why you have such large productivity gaps in developing countries is because not all productive activities are the same in terms of capacity to generate dynamic productivity benefits over time. In particular, I want to draw attention to manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector seems to be critical in the course of development because manufacturing is what I call an automatic convergence sector. What I mean by an automatic convergence or an automatic escalator is that once you are able to get your people, your workers, into formal manufacturing, whether it's producing footwear or it's simple garments, into maybe more complicated stuff like steel or automotive assembly, auto parts, as soon as you get your workers into formal manufacturing activities, it turns out that those workers will be on the automatic escalator up in terms of sustained, rapid convergence to the productivity frontier, regardless of actually what happens in the broad economic context. This is very striking because remember what I said about lack of convergence before when I showed you all those four quadrants going all the way back to 1820, and I said economies as a whole don't converge. But it turns out that there is a part of these economies that automatically does converge, and that's manufacturing. And that's what's shown here in this chart on the left, which is that each one of these dots here is a particular four-digit manufacturing industry in the world. And if you look at sort of what has been happening to labor productivity in these industries, if indeed you do get this now negative slope that we're looking before in the aggregate country level data that we didn't see, but if you look at specific manufacturing industries, you do recover that negative slope, which says that the further behind you are in the productivity frontier, once you've gotten into manufacturing, the more rapidly you will converge, the more rapidly productivity growth will take place. This is extremely good news because it says that, again, sort of supports the structuralist or the focus on structure, which says that a lot of development is actually getting your workers, getting your people, getting your resources into the right sectors. And among those right sectors, manufacturing seems to be key. Now, let's look actually how these structural factors, the fact that not all sectors are the same, that there is great productive heterogeneity, and that success in development requires that you are able to achieve this structural change as rapidly as possible, how some of these key ideas map into the actual performance of different parts of the world or a couple of individual countries. I told you a second ago, I showed you a picture about Brazil and Mexico and how those two countries, as indeed is the case for Latin America in general, had been doing much more poorly in recent times compared to their earlier period. Now, let me look at what the contribution of some of these structural features has been to that change in performance. So this is, the timing here is somewhat different than the timing I had shown you before, but the general lesson isn't going to change. Now, this is overall growth in Latin America, or overall productivity change increase in Latin America in 3 different periods. And again, I want to focus on these 2 periods, the periods before 75 and the period after 1990. Okay? So if you will, the import substitution period, the early import substitution period, and the post-Washington consensus period. This comes from Carmen Pages's work. She and her colleagues decomposed, these are actually sort of my reworking of their numbers, but it's fairly similar. We decompose the overall growth into 2 components. Remember how you're going to get overall productivity growth in a country. The standard way you get growth in a country is going to be that each sector in a country, such as agriculture, manufacturing, transport, utilities, each one of these sectors become more productive, and therefore you get aggregate productivity growth. But there's a second way, and that second way is what the red bar points to, the structural change component. The second component is because you have such wide productivity gaps, you can also get growth, as I was suggesting before, is simply by pulling labor from the lower productivity sectors, such as agriculture and low productivity services, to the more productive sectors. Yeah? So that's the second way you can get growth. So even if no individual sector is experiencing productivity growth, simply by reshuffling your resources, you can get more productivity growth. That's the structural change component. Now, if you look at what's been happening in Latin America, the striking thing is that before 1975, basically about half the growth was due to what was happening within sectors, growth within sectors, and the other half was due to labor moving in the right direction, from agriculture or other low productivity activities to manufacturing and other high productivity services. That's the red component. It's about half. Okay? If you look after 1990, you notice that the within component, or the component of overall growth that is due to growth within sectors, is pretty much the same after 1990 as it was before 1975. But the big change is what has happened to the direction of structural change. Now structural change is actually contributing negatively to overall growth. It's in the negative quadrant. What the hell does that mean? Well, it's weird. It means labor is going from activities where their productivity was higher to activities where their productivity is now lower. This is growth reducing structural change. Structural change, rather than contributing to growth, is actually reducing it. What does that mean in practice? Well, in practice it means, just to sort of indicate one important element in this perverse process, is that manufacturing in Latin America has been shrinking very rapidly in terms of employment. And this deindustrialization, the theory would say, wouldn't be adverse because the workers that are displaced from industry would find even higher productivity jobs elsewhere in the economy. But of course, they don't. Where they end up is in activities that are informal or activities that are service activities that are low productivity. And that's why you get this negative contribution from structural change in 1990 compared to the period before. This also explains the difference in between Latin America and Asia in the period since 1990. So just here I was comparing Latin America today compared to their previous experience. It also turns out that differential patterns of structural change also help explain why Asia has been doing so much better than Latin America, or for that matter, Africa, since 1990. Because it turns out that the big difference is not the within component, the big difference is the structural change component. Or to put it more precisely, roughly two-thirds of the difference in the overall growth rate of Asia compared to Latin America and Africa is accounted for by these differential patterns of structural change. That Asia, for the most part, has managed to get the right kind of structural change going. Latin America and Africa in recent years haven't. And that within productivity growth hasn't sufficiently compensated for that adverse structural change. Now I can show you actually it's interesting to look at the individual countries that's behind those pictures. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's interesting to see, for example, what has happened. I'm going to show you one bad case of structural change and one good case. The bad case, of course, has to come from Latin America, and this is Argentina between 1990 and 2005. What you have on the horizontal axis is the change in employment share of these different sectors. What's on the vertical axis is the relative productivity of each one of these sectors. So what you see here, what really comes out strikingly, is that manufacturing, a relatively high productivity sector, has been the biggest source of employment loss during this period, and other sectors which have been gaining employment are on average not as high productivity, and therefore you have this negative slope of perverse structural change, where labor is going from high productivity manufacturing to much lower productivity services over here. Okay? But of course, it doesn't have to be that way. The typical Asian case looks more like this. The typical Asian case is where labor is coming out of agriculture, where labor is very unproductive, and it's moving into urban services, in particular manufacturing, where labor is that much more productive. This is what development is supposed to be like. But it's striking how, in fact, this has been confined to a relatively small number of countries. What can we tell about the kind of policies that have accounted for or that have been behind these kinds of differential patterns? I think I call the set of policies that worked to produce the desirable kind of structural change, to help structural transformation along, productivist policies. Productivist policies rely in part on sound fundamentals. I don't want to throw away the insights of the Washington Consensus, which is that you need a modicum of stability in the macroeconomic environment. You need a modicum of market friendliness and openness in your economic policies. But you need, in fact, much more. And you don't need to be purists with respect to those fundamentals. You also need, on top, a layer of policies that are going to be supporting these new economic activities. Often that will come along with a certain degree of repression of finance to enable a larger role for development banking, for subsidized credit, and very importantly, competitive currencies. Because one of the most effective ways in which you can actually subsidize, encourage these modern tradable industries which spearhead structural change and economic growth is to have a competitive currency or an undervalued exchange rate that's going to make it profitable for entrepreneurs and investors to go into these modern tradable industries. The currency policy is much, much more productive than any kind of industrial policy that governments can come up with, which are in practice, of course, quite difficult to implement as well. So this is the picture with respect to undervaluation. So let me conclude by where this takes me in terms of both an interpretation and the prognosis. It is true that today policies all around the world in the emerging markets and developing countries are much, much better in a conventional sense, whether we're talking about macroeconomic environment, about financial policies, about public finance, about openness to the world economy. And it is also true that in general we have much better and improved governance around the world. That many civil wars have ended in sub-Saharan Africa. There are many more democracies in the developing world today than there was. But I think the empirical record is that these kind of fundamentals tend to increase the resilience of developing countries without necessarily igniting or sustaining economic growth. That is to say, these are the kinds of things you need to do to throw out all the extreme negative outliers in terms of growth performance. But that doesn't necessarily generate you high economic growth or ignite economic growth. And fundamentally, the argument that I've made is that growth requires something else. It requires an ability to diversify your economy and to accomplish structural change. And this is not something that is automatic. This is not something that happens just after you've established the fundamentals. This requires pragmatic, experimental, and often unorthodox policies in support of new industries. They are often unconventional policies, and they are also often difficult to employ effectively. One has to be very careful in practice with industrial policies, and it is the case that many countries that have tried to implement industrial policies haven't been nearly as successful as Asian countries that have. So these are difficult policies, but in the same sense that just because running the appropriate fiscal policy, having good education policy is also difficult, doesn't lead us to the conclusion that therefore countries or governments shouldn't have any fiscal policy or they shouldn't have any education policies. The argument is the difficulty of industrial policy simply means that we ought to try to work for better industrial policies, not simply give up on it. I think going forward, we are facing a world economy that's going to be much more hostile to the conduct of the types of unconventional, unorthodox policies that have supported growth in the past. There was a time when developing countries were pretty much left alone to pursue whatever currency policies, whatever industrial policies, whatever trade policies, whatever financial policies they wanted to pursue. The world environment, that external environment has changed significantly, most perceptively in the context of the trade rules and with the changes in the World Trade Organization. But I think much more than that. I think we're moving into a world environment where the crisis in Europe and the likely slow growth in the United States in years ahead will make policymakers in the advanced parts of the world much less likely to condone unorthodox policies on the part of large developing countries. And I think that's going to make it very difficult for China to continue with the type of policies it has, and it's going to make it very difficult for other medium or large-sized economies in the developing world to replicate those policies. So that would be a rather sort of unfortunate but pessimistic note on which to end. But I hope I have given you some food for thought about the drivers of economic growth and the importance of structural change. Thank you.